Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1 on Saturdays and Sundays. Also on my site, The Voice for Liberty, that's wichitaliberty.org on the internet. You'll find this episode, show notes for this episode, all the other episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, and all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. Today, it's just me. Carl's on vacation, and I thank Carl for handling the show alone last week. I think it was a very interesting show. The guest was former County Commissioner Kelly Parks, and they talked about property rights and zoning, issues like that, and I would recommend that to you. But today, my guest is Bud Norman. He was a reporter for many years at the Wichita Eagle, covering a variety of beats, including Kansas state government and local culture and arts. Today, he's a novelist, freelance writer, and author of the blog The Central Standard Times, subtitled A View from the Middle of America. You can read that at centralstandardtimes.com, and also sign up for the daily email. That's what I do. And here we were just talking The Things That Are Caesars, a novel by Bud, a comic tale of politics, religion, and other impolite topics. Very funny, I thought it was, and 15 years ago, so it doesn't seem like it can be that long. But Bud Norman, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So you worked for the Wichita Eagle for quite some time. 25 years as a reporter, although it's been a while since you were there. But what's the status of the Wichita Eagle and other hometown newspapers today? With the Wichita Eagle, whatever's going on, it's probably not uncommon compared to other cities.
Oh, you just have to take a glance at, if you happen to come across a newspaper, you just have to take a glance at it. It's smaller, it's thinner, it's reliant more on other McClatchy newspapers, materials. I think all of the state coverage now is out of what is basically the Kansas City Stars Bureau.
A lot of overlap there, definitely.
Yeah, and the staff is smaller. The staff is demoralized, of course. It's just hard times for the whole industry. My parents moved back from living in the Philadelphia area for many years, and they told me that by the time they left, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is one of America's famous, prestigious newspapers. They described it as being as shrunken and skinny and decimated as the Eagle.
So it's not just Wichita; it's really
it's all over, and it's largely, I think, almost entirely due to the technological changes. Once Craigslist came along, the classified advertising business that provided so much of the
Google ads,
newspaper's
Facebook
revenue.
ads, all that.
Yeah, that's gone. It used to be that even if you weren't interested in politics, you'd have to plunk a quarter in the newspaper rack to get a paper, because without the internet, how else do you know where the Royals are and the American League Central standings?
Or when the movies are on.
Or when the movies are on, or what happened to the stocks you bought yesterday. And now that all of that's available for free after a few keystrokes, it's just hard for the old business model that worked for centuries to survive.
Yeah, interesting. Now there's a movement to try to, right now, public notices in Kansas have to be published in newspapers, and there's always a move to try to get rid of that so that they can just be put on the internet or something, and newspapers are really fighting at that because that's a significant source of revenue for them.
Oh, and over the years, back when you used to have two newspapers, one would be for one party, one would be for the other, and they would have an interest in getting those parties elected because they would get the public notice money. In recent years, I believe that they've been publishing those as often in the Derby.
They were at Derby for a while, but then it came back to the Wichita Eagle.
Well, that's important revenue, but that's not going to keep that's not going to be able to finance this kind of staff that the Eagle had when I started there.
You know, a lot of people were mad a couple years ago when the Eagle started printing the paper in Kansas City, I think sharing facilities with the Star, and
another
then
McClatchy
driving it back to
newspaper.
Wichita, and they said, oh, that's the death of the Wichita Eagle. Some people said, what, are they going to fax their stories up to Kansas City? No, I think it's all laid out electronically here in Wichita, then zapped to Kansas City, gets printed, and comes back. I think sometimes it's led to some distribution problems, but other than that, that really wasn't a big deal, was it, do you think? Or?
Well, like I was talking about the sports scores, it means that you don't know what the Royals did on their West Coast
The
swing
deadlines are
until
earlier.
the day after,
Yeah.
You get earlier deadlines and miss out on stuff.
Well, I just thought a lot of people were making more of that than what it's really worth. So let's take a moment off for a commercial break, Bud, and when we come back, I know you've got some opinions about our president, Donald J. Trump. So we will be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Our guest, Bud Norman, journalist and author and blogger at the CentralStandardTimes.com. So, Bud, we're recording on a Thursday. It was Monday that the president, Donald Trump, met with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and for days before that, he was in Europe. You had some pretty strong criticism of what happened over there, and a lot of people do, too.
Yeah, a lot of people do. I'm in this case, you've got some prominent Republicans.
I think the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate.
even several of the Fox News hosts, including one of the guys on Fox and Friends. Was
and when
critical.
Fox and
and
Friends
when Fox
turns
and
against
Friends
the president,
is critical, you know you've got a public relations debacle on your hand.
So yeah, it was really kind of amazing. And you know what? It seems like it's kind of difficult to have a nuanced or balanced view of the Trump presidency. You know, George Will, conservative commentator who's been writing for 40, 50 years or something, someone who is, I think, comes from definitely the intellectual tradition. I post some of his columns, share them on Facebook, and people just go apoplectic because George Will is very critical of Donald Trump these days. The fans of Trump simply cannot admit that, tax cuts were good, but he signed a bill that increased spending a lot, so the deficit's even growing. Yes, judges, good, but the tariff things are going to be very harmful.
This trade war is just insane.
You know, there's good things and bad things, but it seems really hard for opponents to recognize Trump did a few good things, and for Trump fans, they just won't refuse to hear anything bad about their man.
Yeah, and they will embrace positions that were previously anathema to them in order to do it. I remember all through the Cold War, Gene Kirkpatrick's famous speech about how the Democrats always blame America first, and we would deride the moral equivalence that the left would argue that we're just as bad as the Soviet Union. And now I'm driving around and I'm hearing people calling into Sean Hannity's talk radio show going, come on, everybody meddles in everybody's elections. So what if the Russians did get Donald Trump elected? They did it a favor by doing that. And that's not the way conservatives used to talk.
And the conservatives, Republicans, used to be the party of trade, and now definitely returning back to this protectionism with all these tariffs. Now the Trump fans say, oh, it's just part of a long-term strategy of Donald Trump to get fair trade, but these trade wars just spiral out of control and sometimes lead to actual shooting wars on top of the economic harm they do.
Yeah, and there's no Trump isn't able to sit down in front of a television camera and explain to the American public what he's going to rebuild in the wake of. He's going to tear up all these trade arrangements. He's going to tear up all these military alliances. He's going to destroy this long and painstakingly established international order that has mostly brought peace and prosperity to the world. He's going to tear it all down, and the fans love that. But I haven't heard him yet explain what except that it's going to be big and beautiful. He hasn't told us what is going is going to be rebuilt in its wake.
Yeah, the other thing that bothers me about him is everything is either here or here. It's either the greatest, the most beautiful, it's the best, or the people are just terrible. They're liars and cheaters and awful, and they ought to be condemned. And
you know, that's not how life is. In the world we live in, there are most of these things are somewhere in between.
Yeah, and he'll always say how I like someone, we're friends or something. Well, I mean, that's okay, but if that's your basis for appointing someone to a job or something, that's one factor, but it shouldn't be the overriding factor, I don't think, as to whether we're going to have a certain policy or whatever.
I remember I used to run into one of Wichita's most notorious criminals, and he was a charming fellow.
Yeah.
And he genuinely liked me, and still I never put it completely out of my mind that this guy was a career criminal.
So, do you think we're going to survive 2 more years, maybe 6 more years of a Donald Trump presidency?
Oh, I think America's pretty tough. I think
we survived 8 years of Obama after all.
We survived 8 years of Obama, and if you think that was easy, if you're the kind of person who thinks that was easy, we also survived 8 years of George W. Bush, who people thought was just so awful. No, America will survive, but it's not going to come out of it better.
And there's definitely some things that Trump is doing, like kind of blowing up the swamp a little bit, but then he engages in lots of swampy behavior himself and so forth. So it's we need to really look at all the good and bad of Trump and then draw an opinion there. And I do think that, though, there will be prominent Republicans opposing him in the primary starting, after this November election.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's take another commercial break, Bud. When we come back, we're going to turn our attention to local politics and try to figure out how should we decide who's going to be our next governor. Well, welcome back to this third segment of Wichita Liberty TV. For today, I'm Bob Weeks, and our guest is still Bud Norman, journalist, author, and blogger. So we've got some spirited primary elections in Kansas, both on the Republican and Democratic side. And then there's kind of this big third-party candidate, Greg Orman, who's already run a statewide race 4 years ago against Pat Roberts and
lost.
Yeah, and has a lot of money he's willing to spend, I think, plus a lot of contributions as well. So it's going to be kind of a mess there. So as you and I are both Republicans, how are we going to go about deciding who we should vote for in the primary? Do you have a favorite of the candidates?
Not at this point. I have grave doubts about all of them. At the moment, I would be inclined to go with Collier. But in the Republican race, it looks, everyone's talking about Collier and Kobach.
Yeah, that seems to be and I think what limited polling we've had has shown those two way out and ahead with Dr. Jim Barnett and Ken Seltzer
well, this Seltzer guy is running these ads touting the fact that he has absolutely no experience in any government position.
Well, he's been the insurance commissioner
he's trying to make that a virtue. And I just think that after the past year and a half of watching our celebrity apprentice president, people would reject the argument that any kind of experience is something that taints you.
Yeah. The other thing I worry sometimes about Ken Seltzer, and this is to some extent a characteristic of Chris Kobach's running mate, Wink Harkman, is that they're businessmen. They say we want to bring a business approach to government, but government and business are different. Business exists to earn a profit playing within rules and regulations and laws and so forth. The government, we have economic development incentives, at the state level, local level, and everything. They're proud of how many jobs are created. The politicians are. The businessman sees jobs as a cost that should be minimized. I mean, there's this huge conflicts between the goals and operations of business and government. So I'm very skeptical about someone who says, I will bring my business-like approach to government. Doesn't mean that running a business is not valuable experience, but it's just different.
Oh, and also you get to run your business largely the way you want to. And as Trump is finding out, presidents and governors and other executive officials are constrained by constitutions and balances of power and all other
the
sorts
swamp
of,
and all that type of stuff like that. And there is a swamp in Topeka, and that's one thing I kind of appreciate about Chris Kobach is he talks about the culture of corruption, that we're going to have term limits for our legislators, which I strongly agree with. And I said, well, how are we going to do that? Because the legislators don't want term limits. And he says that we could grandfather all current office holders. They can serve as long as they can keep getting elected. But new office holders coming in will be subject to some sort of term limits. And maybe something like that would ease the, sugar-coated enough that we could have term limits.
You can get it done by referendum, perhaps.
We don't have referendum in Kansas.
Oh, and then you can.
And that's one thing Chris Kobach is in favor of, initiative and referendum, although he told me he's not really going to make an issue out of it. So sounds like I'm a Kobach fanboy so far, but if I could just balance that a little bit.
I notice he's really struck. One thing that struck me about the whole Republican governor's race is that nobody mentions Trump, who so dominates.
Well, Kobach does because he's a.
Well, I've noticed that he doesn't bring it up, but they teamed up on that voter fraud commission,
right? Which was disbanded,
which turned out to be a debacle. Yeah. None of the secretaries of state wanted to comply with their requests, and even Kansas couldn't fully reply with the requests that Kobach was making. Well, and the whole notion that, and they were setting out to prove those 3 million votes that won Hillary, the popular vote, were all made up, and that was a fool's errand in the first place. Yeah. So he kind of embarrassed himself in that, and I've also noticed that Collier is stressing education.
He views the increased spending as a good compromise that is going to get this issue out of the courts.
And it gives him an opportunity to reassure people that he's not one of those hardcore Brownbackian, penny pinching. Brownback left office with about the same approval ratings Richard Nixon left office with, and I think as a lieutenant governor, Collier doesn't, wants to kind of distinguish himself from that. And I'm with you on, we got to look at the money we're spending and why we're not getting more out of what we are spending. But just to the south of us in Oklahoma, school districts were running 4 days a week, and teachers are leaving in mass exodus. A certain amount of attention must be paid to the education system.
Yeah, if we want to have that. So, okay, Bud, let's take our last commercial break for today. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with our guest, Bud Norman, this week. Just so I said some good things about Chris Kobach. Let me balance that with, before he was Secretary of State, he was chair of the Kansas Republican Party, and he left that party in a mess. They had filed up all sorts of filings, tax filings, election commission filings, they say, the Republicans nowadays, that they're just recovering from the mess of paperwork and everything that Chris Kobach left. He disputes that. But another thing is, he has a political action committee called the Prairie Fire PAC that raises money and supports candidates. And that's okay for elected officials to do. But Chris Kobach is the state's election officer. And I think that an election officer needs to step back a little bit from being so involved in supporting candidates other than himself, because they do have to run again. So that's just a couple things that I find troubling about him.
Well, prior to Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State was one of the least conspicuous positions.
But a training ground for future governors like Bill Graves and was Secretary of State.
Yeah, but until Chris Kobach, everyone kind of proved that they were doing a good job as Secretary of State because you didn't know they were there.
Yeah. Managing the business filings.
The fact that you never saw their name in the newspapers was proof that they were. They weren't at least they weren't screwing anything up.
And that's the thing about Kobach. He feels very strongly about protecting the integrity of elections, particularly against undocumented illegal alien voters, whatever we want to call them. So he got extra powers so that his office could prosecute these cases. I was thinking all the time, okay, I'm going to expect to see them rounding up a whole busload of Mexicans out by the meat plant trying to get into a polling place to vote. That hasn't happened. There's been less than 20 prosecutions, and most of them have been older people who simply got confused and thought they could vote in Kansas, but also in Colorado because they also owned a property there. So it's been kind of a bust.
Yeah, well, I'm all in favor of election integrity, and I never thought that the photo ID requirement to vote was a particularly onerous imposition. I didn't think that was franchising anybody, but clearly Kobach has a tendency to overstate the problems that he's trying to solve.
I worry about Governor Collier. They try to tie him very closely to Brownback because, after all, he was lieutenant governor. But lieutenant governor in Kansas is really a do-nothing job.
Yeah.
Less than the vice president of the United States, I think, even. And, Brownback may have chosen him because he provided balance to the ticket. He's kind of a little bit, different than he is.
I'm sure it was to reassure the more establishment or country club type Republicans, if you will, who, by the way, are still a significant chunk of the Republican
probably about
Party.
one third of the whole state, I would say. So people are worried, though, that Collier could be soft on Medicaid expansion, that he might, if presented with a bill that passes, that he might actually sign that.
I think that there's all sorts of things that Collier might do that would greatly displease the real hard Tea Party Brownbackian portion of the party. I think that's definitely going to happen.
But I do say both he and Kobach and Dr. Jim Barnett were in that chair right there recently. And I never really met them all on a personal level, but I thought the governor, Jeff Collier, was a very nice and genuine person. He's less bombastic than Chris Kobach is, although now this debate they had in Johnson County last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, they were really, Kobach made up the term Lying Jeff. He told the governor that he was lying. So there was definitely some dissent into...
How clever and original.
Well, where did he get that from? I mean, that's evidence, I think, that Kobach really embraces the Trump thing. I forgot to mention that Donald Trump Jr. was here in Wichita just a few days ago to campaign for Chris Kobach.
That is correct.
Yeah.
And by the way, speaking of celebrity, I think that Jim Thompson, the Democratic congressional candidate,
right.
What on earth is he bringing Bernie Sanders and this
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think
woman.
It is.
You've got the two darlings of the farthest left reaches.
Right.
And the reason James Thompson made such a close run of it in the special election is because he positioned himself as an old-fashioned centrist not at all crazy
He
Democrat.
campaigned holding an AK
Yeah,
or
he's
something or
a
other.
guns. He was in the military. He's not one of those crazy leftists. So,
But here he's got,
what an incredibly inept decision.
And he did
that
say that last campaign that Bernie Sanders was what inspired him to enter politics. And before that, he'd been a Republican. So
Well, that's not how you win a
Yeah.
4th district race, I'll tell you.
I don't think so. So anyway, Bud, we've run out of time for today. Lots more we could talk about, but that's just it for today. So thank you, Bud, for coming in today. I'm Bob Weeks, your host, and we hope to see you again next week.
Always a pleasure, Bob.
Thank you.